Hello and welcome to Transforming Tomorrow, the podcast from the Pentland Centre for Sustainability in Business. I'm Paul Turner.
And I'm Professor Jane Bevington. Today we're chatting space. No, we're not going back to asteroid mining. We're going to be talking about the complex world of spatial science and the information we can get about a given place, like an ocean or a large area of land, and then how we can analyse biodiversity over that area and link it through to business activities.
Jan, I want to return to a topic from a long time ago that we covered in one of the first episodes of Transforming Tomorrow, but that I think we can bring new angles to today. Does that sound like a good idea?
It's a great idea. And what was that topic?
Biodiversity. I want to talk about how businesses deal with biodiversity, how they address the challenges that biodiversity brings and how they shape their strategies around what biodiversity can mean to them and how they can help biodiversity.
And it's a really smart topic to be returning to because concern about the state of nature and biodiversity and the services that nature provides to people and to businesses keeps on climbing up the agenda, but also requirements for better management practices, for reporting on those management practices, and for really being systematic and strategic in how businesses think about biodiversity has intensified since we first talked about it probably about 2 years ago or so.
And we've touched upon it occasionally in different podcasts since then, but we've not had that as the specific focus of a podcast. But there's so much that we can be thinking about the different types of action that companies can be taking, about the risks that they face when it comes to what they're doing. There's so much that could be going on.
And business needs help. And I think particularly our guest today is one of those bodies that help business make sense of those things.
Yes, because we're joined today by Dr. Michael Burgess, who works for Biodiversify, and they are a company that uses cutting-edge science to understand some of these complex social, ecological systems and develop biodiversity strategies. And some of the companies that Michael and Biodiversify are working with are some of the biggest in the world, so they are in a position to make a big difference, or hopefully they're in a position to make a big difference.
Excellent.
Michael, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
No problem at all. Can you tell us a little bit, Michael, about your background and how you've ended up advising businesses on biodiversity issues?
My background in terms of my academic career, I did geography at uni for an undergrad and then went into a master's in marine environmental management. So my kind of focus, or what I was interested in, was always around kind of conservation issues, how humans kind of relate to their environment, how they impact it, how they depend on it. And that sort of, shaped my interest in biodiversity, I think, as a whole. I kind of graduated back in 2010, which was a terrible time to graduate because it was the, aftermath of the global recession, and it was difficult to come by job. I think originally I wanted to be more of a conservationist or start my career as a, what I would call a proper conservationist within an NGO, getting into the field and, doing more of those typical things. And after looking for a job for a few months, I was on the precipice of going to do that in Egypt, doing kind of scuba diving and marine conservation. And then the Arab Spring sort of hit right as I was going to go. So I had to turn that down and instead went to work for a business in a more of a traditional graduate scheme, I suppose, doing environmental consulting for a company called RSK. So that, I guess, kind of set things in motion. And after a few years of working in kind of infrastructure and oil and gas, doing environmental social impact assessment, I got a bit jaded with the kind of procedural element of it all and the tick boxy type nature of it. And I felt that it wasn't perhaps as impactful as I wanted it to be. And so I went to do a PhD and want to do something different, change up my networks, get some new skills, and that sort of turned the tables on everything, really.
And from that work, did you then sort of really set your sights on business advisory services that are really not tick boxy, but are actually strategic and engaged and real world in a real way?
I think it was sort of a background intention. I think with biodiversity in particular, if those jobs had been available at the time, I probably would have moved into that straight away. They just simply didn't exist at that time. It was really only probably, these kind of extractive sectors, the ones that were engaging with biodiversity very directly, that were kind of, they were the only ones really considering biodiversity directly. The breadth of companies now is so much more, but I think through doing the PhD, I started thinking from a policy perspective in my research. So I was looking at large scale targets around biodiversity. So at the time it was the Aichi targets in the global biodiversity framework, and companies were making kind of national level targets on that. And my research was looking at how do we track progress towards them. So how do we measure biodiversity at large scales? What are the problems with doing that in terms of creating indicators and metrics, how they relate to the targets, how do we get through some of the uncertainties? And so as I got to the end of my, PhD, that, became a useful skill set for when, as businesses started to get more engaged in this topic, and there were lots of questions around, what do biodiversity targets look like for a business? How would a business measure progress? So I think it helped me gain a lot of the underlying skills to kind of start tackling some of those questions.
What is it that's particularly rewarding and impactful then about working directly with businesses when it comes to biodiversity?
Well, I think it's just the innovation really, and the fact that it's just kind of the new frontier in terms of conservation science. We know from a global perspective what the main drivers of biodiversity loss are, particularly with things like land use change driven by expansion of agriculture, and that's essentially driven by consumption, and businesses are kind of at the heart of that, producing the goods driving biodiversity loss. So understanding how to tackle that is the great challenge of our time, that a lot of people are thinking from a policy perspective, but actually how you implement, say, policy or change, particularly within a corporate setting, there's so many unknowns basically. So I think we very much work in this space of like real applied research from a sort of understanding perspective, but then I think there's a huge amount of kind of social science, decision making, negotiation, like all these types of things that also come into play. So to work in the space, you kind of need a team, or you need people who are well rounded at lots of different things. So it just makes for a really engaging workspace, I think.
Do you find that when you're going in there as an external voice that's been brought in, sometimes you're listened to more than when you were in those previous roles that you mentioned that sometimes felt a bit like tick box exercises for the oil and gas industry that you were working in? Do you find that your voice is listened to more as an external advisor on these issues?
Oh yeah, it's night and day, I think. A lot of the big extractives, they have really good expertise in-house, to be honest, themselves. So they have quite a high level of technical understanding anyway. And really what the environmental processes are there, they're part and parcel of getting work done. So they're almost viewed as like a constraint or a blocker to getting stuff done. So you feel under quite a lot of pressure to just get stuff done, and clients will push you around to make sure to keep stuff moving, or try and say, I don't think we need to do this actually, like this isn't important, and these types of things. Whereas this topic you're basically doing for the most part education as well. It's changed a lot over the past 2 or 3 years, but certainly when we started previously, there was a very much openness to what is this topic, what does it even mean, how does it even relate to us? And so we've been on a journey with the people that we've been working with for a while. Their understanding is increasing, and then together what you can do is just more and more, really.
Do you find you're generally then working with the companies who have to start with an interest in this before they've even brought you in, the ones who are maybe more at the more proactive end of the scale?
Yes, 100%. That has been the trend, and why a small company like us has had the opportunity to work with some of the biggest brands and and companies out there, because it really has been the sustainability leaders driving this topic area forward. I think the interesting thing is now that it's definitely mainstreaming more. So we're seeing the next wave, like what we would call like sort of fast followers or this kind of thing. So it's you're seeing a different type of company coming into asking questions about this topic now, which is cool, really.
I can see Jan's desperate to ask a question, but I've got one more question to keep going along this chain. And that's, you talk about there was the people at the leading edge and then there's the fast followers. Do you think eventually, though, that everyone is getting on this train?
I mean, you'd hope so, right? I think, but I think we have to also make it manageable for different businesses. You know, I have seen people talk about SMEs, you know, reporting on this kind of stuff, but you've also got to appreciate the constraints that different businesses are under, the levels of expertise and capabilities, and these types of things. So I think what, you know, say an SME would be thinking about in regard to this might be at a lot more basic level than you know, somewhat like the much larger global international companies, which have far more resource and also sway and influence over their, you know, supply chains and peers and things like that. So I think, you know, it's a topic that connects with people fundamentally. It's a lot more tangible than climate change and carbon. It's something you can see and feel and kind of understand. So I think it does have like a lot of potential to keep spreading, and yeah, we'll see.
Given that it is so important, but also given that it's kind of new, what kind of challenges do people you've worked with face when they're trying to, you know, deal with nature and biodiversity? What's tough for them to get started or even to progress further? I
think the big thing is this the scale of the complexity, I suppose. I think while bringing this topic to the fore with business, a lot of that's happened by a combination of scientists, academics, and, you know, people like us who are kind of scientists and you know, NGO background anyway. But, you know, as conservationists, we like to tackle the root challenge. We like to think big. We like to do everything. So when you get into some of the, you know, increasing, I mean, I guess we'll come into this, but the increasing legislation or, you know, the frameworks in this space and what they're asking of companies, it's really, really detailed. So obviously Scope 3 climate, you know, emissions for climate is really complex, and loads of people have trouble deciphering that. Well, basically Scope 3 is at the heart of biodiversity. Like that's almost the starting point rather than the bit to come down the line. We get people to dive right into the detail, and not only do you have to understand you know, relative volumes or costs of your supply chain, you also need to know exactly where you're sourcing from, and that's also challenging because that's not something businesses have ever really been asked to do before. So you're looking to unpick geographically your supply chain, and then you need to know, well, biodiversity is impacted by lots of different pressures on your from your supply chain. So you've got to think about pollution, you've got to think about land use change, you've got to think about the effects of climate change on biodiversity, over extraction of water, and all these different things. There's so many facets that it's just really, really complicated. So the biggest challenge is getting people to get their heads around it, I suppose, first and foremost, and how to actually go about thinking about it and tackling it.
So you talk about these challenges. Does that vary across different sectors and the different businesses you're dealing with as well? Are you dealing with one company that might have a whole different set of issues they want to address as opposed to another?
Yeah, definitely. So I think in the early days, before, talking about sort of 4 5 years ago with the really early leaders, we approach things from a strategic point of view. So, because there's also a lot of benefits to thinking about this in terms of the business. So if you take a strategic standpoint and not just focus on impact, you can think about broader ambition in terms of places and spaces and how biodiversity or nature or ecosystem services relate with your customers, your staff, your operations, and these types of things. And we've seen some really interesting case studies over time of, say, tech companies that we've worked with in Silicon Valley they really took this topic from a place perspective and a recruitment perspective. You know, having amazing biodiverse campuses was seen as a really key driver for attracting and retaining staff, and that angle actually is what managed to unlock funding to improve or do more around biodiversity. The decision making within the business can be different based on, you know, the different ambitions. With the income of different frameworks and things, like I was talking about, the focus really has gone on to impact and dependency within the supply chain, and that's where, you know, depending on the complexity of that supply chain it can be a bit night and day. If you say got a fashion retailer, say, they might only deal with a handful of materials compared to a supermarket who deal with, say, thousands and thousands of product lines. Tackling that is much more challenging.
When you're talking about, you know, those frameworks, one of the frameworks that are out there is the Science-Based Targets for Business Initiative. Could you tell us something about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll shorten it to SBTN for ease, but the SBTN is basically the next kind of evolution or partnership with the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which is, you know, well known within climate circles. The difference is obviously this one is about nature, and fundamentally it's about providing a science-based methodology for companies to be able to set targets on nature and then meet them. It's been around a little while. It's basically constantly in development. Like I say, because it's such a complex topic, I don't think this will, you know, potentially ever end. But it basically walks you through a number of steps in terms of target setting. And it's based around target setting for different realms. So at the moment, there's kind of land targets where there's a full methodology, and there's also freshwater targets where there's a full methodology. But there'll be ocean targets to come, and the idea is to kind of iterate on these methodologies as they're being tested. At the moment, the pilot process has been complete, but we're still in the kind of early stages. The other thing about it is it's going to provide a platform for companies to be able to have their targets validated, much the same way as the Science-Based Targets Initiative on climate. So it basically provides the highest rigor in terms of kind of target setting and delivery. I suppose the interesting thing on this, again, it really is about value chain primarily. There's quite a high requirement to assess your value chain through this, but the targets aren't set at a corporate level other than a couple. But the main thing is to have place-based targets. So it's basically about understanding and prioritizing where your key sourcing landscapes are, and then setting targets within them. So it's a very different way of thinking and operating for businesses, essentially. So to give an example of that in terms of like water, for example, so it would be highlighting where throughout your supply chain, water is the biggest, you know, a big issue in terms of drought or these types of things, and then setting a target for the basin as a whole, and then understanding what your contribution should be to that basin. So really specific, and obviously, yeah, a bit different for businesses.
How much of an input do businesses themselves have when it comes to shaping what targets should be? And does your work as advisors for this business help in any way to shape what these standards, targets, etc. should be?
Yeah, I mean, this has been an interesting one with SBTN, because the idea is that it or the underpinning of it is it's science-based. So in a way, businesses haven't really been part of the methodology creation, because the idea is it should be, you know, science-driven, for a better world type of thing. I think the problem that, you know, we've had, or that kind of keeps unfolding, is that if you want something to be implementable, you also need to consider the people who are going to be implementing these things. So it's always been the knotty sort of point with SBTN, is like, how do you balance that? And so there have been tests and pilots alerts and these types of things where businesses have been able to feed back. But ultimately, SBTN is a group of NGOs and scientific institutions and things, so they do kind of make the final decisions on these things. I think, yeah, it's a real trade-off and I don't quite have the answers for it, because you want something that's challenging, obviously, and that leads to better improvement. It's also got to be scalable, and I think that's the tricky point at the minute.
In your view, at the moment, do you think it's got the right balance so that enough businesses, once it's all drawn up, will actually take part in the initiative? Or do you still feel it's either too difficult or too complex or not quite aiming at the right targets for them?
So I think it's a number of steps. Basically, the first two steps are about the prioritization of what areas of the value chain to focus on and these types of things. I think they've got that bit eventually pretty good, and actually is the only methodology that you can follow out there, basically, which again is a bit of a problem from a rigor point of view. If you're not following that methodology as a business, then what methodology are you following, or are you being transparent about what you're following? So I think, we tend to advise to follow the methodology for the first two steps, because it is very much more around materiality, prioritization, and these elements. Once you move into the kind of more place-specific stuff, I mean, that in itself is a incredibly high barrier for most companies to look at the moment. So I think you will be limited in terms of the actual target setting in places to sustainability leaders at the moment. And how scalable that is, not sure. I think to make it easier to scale, they probably need to consider sort of collaborative ways of working, how to bring in others, like I say, fast followers, without being able to hold their hands a bit more or bring them into those spaces and actually get companies working together within landscapes, which it doesn't actually make sense for every company to be trying to operate individually, and a lot more can be made working together. So that's probably the way to scale it, I would think.
And in answering that, you actually sort of prejudged the question I was going to ask. That in a place-based piece of work in an ecosystem, there's obviously other businesses. So sometimes fast followers might be people who see the leaders and want to do the same. But there might be spatial followers, if we could use that phrase, which is entirely illegitimate in a way. That you've got maybe an anchor institution, you're a large company in an ecosystem, and everyone who's around says, well, okay, can we work together to jointly achieve things? So I think that gives almost a different sense to what a follower would be. It could be people participating in a particular locale, because I think you're absolutely on the ball when you identify that nature action has to happen where in a place. It's very place-based, which makes it really tough, because if you're a very large organisation, you're in lots of different places, and so you've got a volume problem going on as well.
Absolutely.
So when you're thinking about maybe using the science-based targets for nature initiative or other approaches to deal with nature, what kind of steps from a generic perspective would a business have to do to start down this route? So if you were going to give them, on this podcast, the ABC of how to get going, what would those steps be?
So I think in terms of starting to understand things, like I was listening to the podcast that you did on the Task Force for Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures.
He can't get that wrong. I wasn't allowed to get that wrong. He's certainly not allowed to get that wrong.
Yeah, you caught me out there definitely as well. So that provides a pretty loose framework for kind of walking through some of these things. So like I said before, it's sort of about locating your interfaces with nature through your value chains, evaluating in those locations. So looking at the different pressures that are exerted from those activities, and the sensitivity of the biodiversity itself in those locations. And then starting to prioritize essentially in terms of where we need to work or look at or think about. I think interestingly here, the emphasis is very much on science, or science having the answers, and these types of things. I'd go a bit broader than that, and I think you have to be a bit broader in terms of when you're starting to take action, and where's actually feasible, like where's where's possible, where can you get the most traction, and bang for your buck, and these types of things, because I think ultimately we want to start moving people towards action, and that comes, like you say, from moving off kind of spreadsheets, graphs, analyses, and actually if you are actually going to go out and do something, it's got to be workable, and that's you can't let that get in the way of not doing anything. So yeah.
Is anything that's actually meaningful easy in this, or is anything that these businesses want to do that's actually going to have a real impact, that's going to be meaningful? Is it all tough for them?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. It's a bit like Scope 3, I think. Going back to the Scope 3 analogy, like if you look at the whole picture, Scope 3 stands out massively, right? And like I say, we tend to jump into the supply chain side, but obviously once you get into the supply chain, that your sphere of influence, your control over these things weakens. And often the direct operations and your actual footprint and these things can be overlooked, but that's the stuff that's directly in your control, basically, and you can do more. So we do encourage clients to think about that, particularly ones who have large land holdings, and these types of things. So we've actually been engaged with a number of people now who are starting to look at their global estates and portfolios, starting to look at measuring the biodiversity on them in terms of getting a baseline, and then looking at how to roll out basically sort of restoration or conservation efforts across their estates, essentially, which when you put it in the context of supply chains, probably doesn't come out that impactful, but like in terms of something you can actually do and get going on, and that definitely has impact locally in those places, 100%. And the other thing is, I think when you're working with these businesses, these types of things are held by different teams. So like the estates management, estates team will be a completely different team to procurement and supply chain. So there's absolutely no reason why you can't get going on two things at once with different teams.
So there's lots of talk here about place, and in the briefing for this episode, when I mentioned there were lots of things that confused me, one of the things that was mentioned was spatial science. So I want to explain how spatial science might be appropriate with regards to this kind of action. But first of all, tell us what spatial science actually is.
Yeah, so we have a lot of people in our team are much more adept than myself at spatial science and spatial analyses. But essentially, it's it's looking at spaces in land, oceans, etc., maps of the world that contain different data sets on different things. So looking spatially, how say biodiversity differs around the world, how pressures are exhibited differently around the world, and then using those data layers in different ways to answer questions of interest. And it's complicated, and it's very time consuming, because it's an awful lot of data once you start to add up different global data layers, for example, and then try and produce meaningful results. So there's a lot of kind of modeling, a lot of analysis that needs to be done, and testing assumptions and these types of things to understand if you're kind of getting to the root of it, so to speak.
And I suppose I'll give a very simple example if it helps. So if you're a fishing company and you're wanting to fish in particular waters, there may be regulatory requirements when you can't fish because maybe there's creatures breeding in the space, and that they need to be left alone to do that. But some of the things then gets quite complicated is about when species move around. So natural science data sets exist for how different species move and at what time they move and where they're moving to and from. And if you have operational assets in that area, whether it be, for example, it could be wind turbines in the ocean, or it might be shipping lanes, or it could be fishing activities, so directly using materials, then you might modify your operations in order to be able to ensure that the migratory patterns or the breeding patterns can be sustained naturally and your operations aren't mucking around with them. Now, that that's, how do you know where seabirds are moving? That's a big natural science question for which there are big data sets. But there's usually a data set for each species, sometimes subspecies. So how are you going to layer them on top of it and actually be able to make impactful operational decisions becomes really complex. So it's a fantastic area, but as Michael says, really hard work to get that right.
Complex.
So there were a couple other things that I think that you might want us to explain, Paul, both physical and transition risks. And I think our listeners will be really interested to know what the differences are between those two categories as well. So over to you, Michael. How would you explain to a business the difference between these two aspects?
First of all, how would you explain what both of them are? I don't want to know just the difference. I want to know what each of them are. Yeah.
Okay, yes. We can start
Go
from
back
the
to
beginning.
basics. Always start from the basics.
Yes, indeed.
Well, feel free to help me out, Jan, because it's I know it's topic close to you as well. In terms of how we talk about risk or thinking about risk, I mean, we deal probably primarily in what we do with physical risk or thinking about physical risk. So we're in the context of a business, that is, how does the environment around it or that interacts with it, how that is changing, particularly in the face of climate change and biodiversity loss, and how will that impact their operations and their day to day. And actually, I mean, when I started doing this, I assumed, because of how advanced climate modeling was and all these types of things, that businesses would actually be pretty adept at understanding future climate risk and these types of things, let alone biodiversity risk. And actually, kind of found that not really to be the case, which was pretty surprising, particularly when physical risk is rearing its head here and now all the time. I think that it's an interesting area that I think will bring home issues around climate change, around biodiversity, much quicker, because the impacts are already being felt, basically. And then transition risk is more about the kind of I guess the policy, markets, human responses to the changing world, and how that is going to put businesses at risk as well, in terms of changing consumer preferences or policy changes, making things harder for business, like say electric cars, or mandating that certain amounts of electric cars need to be built, or things that businesses need to be aware of and be able to respond to. And I guess that one's probably harder to model in a way, like certainly the physical risks. You can I think scientists are very good at modeling actually different futures and potential futures and things like that. Businesses maybe not so used to actually sort of understanding that as a concept or thinking about that as a concept. So that's probably the gap there.
And I suppose the big issue with transition risk, which we're sitting in the middle of at the moment, is that it can come and go as well. So preferences
exactly.
can come and go. So if you were looking forward, and this is one of the reasons why I really like some of your LinkedIn posts, is that you look forward and say, well, okay, what's the future landscape likely to look like for business and biodiversity? And so what do you see in that future in the near term, given a variety of pressures for people who want to give up worrying about the natural environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really interesting thing. I think the more, particularly as the physical risk is impacting more, like we see this as basically becoming much more business critical, and actually you're not necessarily just arguing it from a transition risk or a changing consumer preference and this type of thing. Like the actual business realities of issues being caused is here, and it is felt already. Things like cocoa prices, for example, have like rocketed over the past year or 18 months, and that's largely down to climate change and poor growing conditions and these types of things. So the outlook is we need to do actually as a community, probably make our case more strongly, understand the business side. I mean, that's probably how we've changed our tune as a business, or gone from starting out as sort of conservation scientists into people really kind of obsessed with understanding how businesses operate, and how do you float the messaging in the right way, or how do you get things across, try and get things across to people in different parts of the business who are more senior, or these types of things. So that's the future, really. Nothing like the future's kind of set. We're going to see more of this happening. So it's about how we communicate with intent to get the message home, I think.
Have you seen any examples from all the companies that you've worked with, or what you would consider best practice that you maybe can see being adopted moving into the future?
I mean, there's lots of good stuff happening within different companies for sure. Like, there's now a collection of, say, biodiversity strategies that has gone on to, I think it's Business for Nature or one of those types of websites that's compiling all different biodiversity strategies. There's some really good examples in there. We've done a lot of work with Tetra Pak, for example, who have combined kind of biodiversity, water, and carbon into a single nature strategy that cuts across their entire kind of value chain, including kind of downstream elements as well, which I think is pretty groundbreaking. And then there's obviously different companies who are more adept at sourcing, have been thinking deeply about sourcing for a long time, and therefore are able to accelerate what that means on the ground, and taking things like forestry, for example, that hasn't typically been managed for biodiversity, but if we're starting to demand, actually, well, we need to understand what the biodiversity is in these forests, how we're going to improve it. That's really, really exciting. But I think when you look at the sort of benchmarks of companies, and there's a few benchmarking operations out there, you can still see even at the top there's quite big gaps collectively. There's a long way to go. I don't think you could say any company is nature positive or anything to that regard. We've got a lot more to do, basically.
Did you know there were lots of benchmarking organisations out there, Jen?
Don't wind Paul up, Michael. I told you before, never mention the benchmarking. I'm just going to step away from that.
Leave the benchmarking on and exit the room. So just to round things off then, Michael, we won't talk about benchmarking. Jan will be disappointed to it. But where do you see inspiration and hope in this area, despite all the challenges that we're facing?
Yeah, there's plenty of hope. I think we're seeing this combination of companies starting to understand the need to work on the ground. At the same time, I think you're seeing massive interest from financial institutions coming to the fore who want to know what the role of capital is in this, and how we make capital improve this situation. You've got this kind of flourishing nature tech startup space that is really, really exciting. And I think the monitoring and verification and all this type of stuff, when you get the financial institutions involved, you're going to have to provide rigor on that front. So I think all the pieces are really coming together. I think the challenge that we spend a fair bit of time thinking about, but is how to pull it all together. Like, how do you you've got all these things that are up there, and they have to be brought together, and you've got to kind of take a risk on that. You've got to maybe expect the first couple of times to not achieve the success that you want to, but take the learnings and share from them. But there's a huge amount of enthusiasm from all different actors to improve things. It's just it takes brave people, I think, to try it and get things moving.
Well, Michael, it's been a really great conversation with you today. I'll forgive you your mentioning of accounting, your mentioning of benchmarking, because you brought much more to the table in terms of the biodiversity and everything. Thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, thank you very much for having me.
Every time we come back to biodiversity, Jan, there's always something new that we learn.
And what did you learn this time that was new?
I learned that people keep talking about benchmarking and accounting, even when they're talking about biodiversity. But not only that, but the tie-in between biodiversity and the consumption-based society and business. The fact that if you are an expert on biodiversity and you go into a company as an external expert, they'll listen to you more than maybe they would have listened to you if you were hired by them and worked for them full-time. Lots of interesting elements.
And I thought of Catherine Ellsworth-Krebs's podcast where she was talking about what a sustainability manager does. And it seemed that Michael had been one of those, and then an external advisor, and sometimes can get further in the door as an external advisor.
And he's not the first person we've had on who's worked in the oil and gas industry as well. And it's interesting that there's been a few people who've worked within that sphere who've then come on and worked very more specifically around sustainability.
I should have told you that I used to do a lot of research into the oil and gas industry. I don't think I've ever admitted that. Yeah. So
whenever we've talked about it with anyone else, you've kind of kept stum, but it turns out you were the biggest proponent of oil and gas at the last two COP conferences.
Not exactly. But when I worked at the University of Aberdeen, I did a lot of work with the oil and gas majors because they were the key players in that area. But also they've got some really challenging problems, especially when you think about business and biodiversity. So it's a really good learning ground as well as you move on to other areas.
And speaking to Michael, it's obvious that we talked a lot about science-based targets, but the importance of as well of what's feasible, because science-based targets might want businesses to do lots of things, and it seems that a lot of these science-based targets will speak to businesses if they have to, but do they incorporate that into what the targets end up being? Maybe not as much as they should.
The other thing he said, though, that I thought was really interesting and sort of speaks to that point is that he's looking at businesses thinking about strategies, but they're not doing strategies for climate separate from water, separate from biodiversity, but actually having strategies for those elements coming together because of the interplay between them. So that joining up of strategic orientation, I think, will serve us all well.
So what have we got coming up next week, Jan? Do you want me to tell you what we've got coming up next week?
Yes, please.
Because next week is the last episode of the series.
Ah.
This has been the penultimate episode. Next week will be the final episode of the series, and it'll just be me and you. And you'll remember that experience from last year where there was lots of really fun questions for you to consider.
I think we should be more democratic this year and ask you a bunch of fun questions as well.
I've checked, and that's not possible. But we'll be looking back over the series that we've just had, looking at the various issues that have inspired people and looking a little bit ahead to what we're going to be discussing in the next series, which will be coming up in the autumn.
And I think one of the things I like about how we're planning this final episode is that listeners would have realised that we asked lots of people at the end of their guest slot on the podcast what was inspiring them. So we're going to integrate some of that together because we do need inspiration. All of us need inspiration. And in the year that this podcast is being produced, there are a lot more reasons to need inspiration because the ground for sustainability in business has become more complicated. It's become more contested. In some places, people have walked away from commitments they've made in the past. So I think it's important to actually draw those things together and make a thematic analysis of what were the things that made people hopeful. So hopefully that might make our listeners hopeful as well.
Well, until that inspiring finale to the season, thank you very much for listening. I'm Paul Turner.
And I'm Professor Jane Bevington.